Hi, in this video we demonstrate how to deploy microservices in a Kubernetes cluster. These microservices define the front-end and back-end tier services of a distributed and decoupled guestbook application. We deploy a Redis master database backend to store messages from users, read-only Redis slave database backends for high availability and resiliency, and a PHP front-end service that sends new messages to and retrieves prior messages from the Redis backend. We have a Kubernetes cluster, and if we run kubectl get nodes, we see that we have one master node and two worker nodes. Now let's examine the YAML manifests of the API objects prior to deploying them in the cluster. So let's start with the Redis master manifest. So let's run cat Redis master YAML. Now it defines a deployment object which will manage a single pod, so a single Redis pod, and the Redis pod will run the Redis container image, and we specify port 6379, which then has to be exposed via the Redis master service defined below, which will then expose port 6379 internally inside the cluster, and it will allow the front end to send messages to the back end. Now let's take a look at the Redis slave manifest. This manifest also defines a deployment, the Redis slave deployment. Now this deployment will be managing two pods, both pods running the Redis slave container image. And again, we're exposing the same port 6379 through a service, but now we're exposing it to the Redis slave service. And this service allows the front end to retrieve messages from the back end. And finally, let's examine the front end manifest. So cat front end YAML. This one also defines a deployment. It is the front end deployment. It will be managing three pods, because we have three replicas at this point. It will be running the front end container image. And we have to expose port 80 of our containers. And this port 80 will be exposed through a service defined below. Now this is an external service, and this external front-end service allows public users who are external to the cluster to talk to the front-end pods running inside the cluster. So let's deploy these API objects. So let's start with the master. kubectl apply -f Redis master YAML, and it tells us that the deployment and the service have been created. Let's do the same thing with the slave.yaml. Again, the objects have been created. And now let's run kubectl apply -f front end YAML, and the deployment and the service have been created. Now let's verify that all the objects are in a ready and running state. So kubectl get deployment, pod, and service. Those are the only three types of resources that we are concerned about at this point. So as we see the three deployments, the Redis master deployment managing a single pod, the Redis slave deployment managing 2 pods, and then the front-end deployment managing 3 pods. So the pods are listed just below. So the master pod, a single pod in running state. The slave pods, 2, both in running state. And then the front-end pods, all 3 in a running state. And finally, the services. The master service, internal service exposing port 6379. The slave service, internal, exposing the same port 6379. But then the front-end service is an externally facing service, and it exposes port 80 via a port mapping to a node port. And in this scenario, we received randomly a high port value of 30086. Now, when this high port or node port is paired with the IP address of one of the nodes, it allows us to access the guestbook application from anywhere. So with all those resources ready and running in the cluster, let's try to access the guestbook. So for that, we need a browser. Let's bring that over. We need the IP address of one of the worker nodes. And I have that here. And then we need to type in the high port, 30086. And we hit enter. And here we have our guestbook. So currently it does not display any messages. But let's submit a few messages and see what happens. So let's start by saying hello. Hit submit, and the hello message was registered and it's displayed in the guestbook. For the following message, let's type in something longer. Introduction to Cloud Infrastructure Technologies. Submit. And here it is. And as the third and the last message, let's say Kubernetes is great. Hit submit. And the message is here. So in this video, we deployed the microservices of a distributed application in a Kubernetes cluster. We explored a few of the most basic API objects of the Kubernetes application, deployments, pods, and services, together with their brief YAML configuration manifests. And then finally, we accessed the application through a public connection over the internet. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.